Welcome back, everybody. We are going to start off by covering chapter 1, which is economics and the study of choice. So we're going to talk a bit about both those topics, economics and how it is the study of choice and what that means in application. So let's get started. First of all, the favorite economic term or phrase, no such thing as a free lunch. This means that even when you think you are getting something for free, the limitations in our reality mean that in one way or another you're paying for this. Whether or not you realize it is the real question. This all surrounds the idea that we have limitless wants and limited resources to meet them, which is scarcity, right? There's a such thing as scarcity. And every want that we choose to fulfill comes with an opportunity cost, the value of what we missed out on. So if there is scarcity every time we make a choice, that choice means that we are choosing to do something, but also inherently choosing not to do another thing. We can see this in action, for example, with the state budget. So looking at where the 2021 dollar comes from at the city level, actually, we can see that we get around 33 cents of this from property taxes, 36 from other taxes and local revenues, 17 cents from state aid, and various other sources of revenue. This is effectively the city's version of a limited resource. The limited resource in this case being revenue, the amount of money that can be collected from taxes and from other revenue sources. And of course, complementing that is the unlimited wants. Where does the 2021 dollar go to? You can see that we spend about 37% of the budget on education, 17% on social services, and various other aspects of running a city that fall under higher education, health, fire, environmental protection. There are dozens of city agencies that operate, and all of those represent basically our choice. The fact that we funded education by 37% means that we couldn't fund social services past 17%, or pick any of the other competing obligations that our budget represents. And the fact that we made a choice in one area presented an opportunity cost in what choice we couldn't make in another area. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. So this give and take between our limited resources and our limitless wants takes the form of an annual balancing of the budget that we do in the city. You can see in the example in front of you that on the left-hand side we have revenues in millions of dollars coming in various fiscal years from 2020 to fiscal year 2022. On the right-hand side, we have the expenditures, the amount of spending that the city expects to do to manage the services that need to be provided. And you can see that if we're looking at the same columns, FY 2020, total revenues 97 billion, expenditures 97 billion. 21, total revenues 89.3 billion, and expenditures 89.3 billion. But in 2022, we have an issue here where we expect to receive almost $4 billion in revenues from various sources, taxes, aid, grants, but we anticipate spending almost $100 billion, right, with 99.4 billion, leaving us with a gap of about $5 billion between what we are anticipating in revenue and what we are anticipating in expenses. That $5 billion means that some service is going to need to be cut, right? Somebody is not going to get the mental health services they need. There may be certain uniformed services that aren't provided, or the same level of enrollment in new classes won't happen. There may be a person who isn't going to have access to their caseworker. These are the very real consequences of this scarcity, right? It's not just a abstract term that we speak of. What we're talking about is the real fact that when a push comes to shove, we can't provide everyone with everything that they need. And at some point, you're going to have to make a cut somewhere, and you have to consider what is the opportunity cost of the choice that you are making versus the choice that you're not making. So, what better way to kind of illustrate that than with deciding what to produce in terms of two very basic services: education versus law enforcement. In economics, we need to answer three questions that'll get us to a decent enough place, at least, to try to start answering this question of education versus law enforcement. Three questions as economists we need to answer is: what will we produce? And of course, the choices here are education or law enforcement. And the basic choice of scarcity is: what will we produce, education or law enforcement? How do we produce? So whether or not we're going to produce education or whether or not we're going to produce law enforcement, we need to figure out what we're going to use to produce either one of those things. That is just as important as deciding what we're going to produce. And for whom will we produce? So once we do produce either education or law enforcement, how do we determine who can access the output of our production? Will it be free for everybody? Will it be only for people within a certain jurisdiction? Will people have to pay for it? How will people pay for it? These are the three main questions of economics, and we'll be spending the next few chapters analyzing each one of them pretty individually to lay out for you how you go about answering these questions. And the choices will matter a lot more when we start to discuss comparative advantage, which is coming up in the next chapter. And the reason this choice becomes more important in that context is because the thing that we choose to produce, we may choose to produce it not just because it's something that is in demand in our economy or something that we think is right for the economy, but because we are better at producing it than other people in other economies are. But we'll talk more about the comparative advantage side in the next chapter. These questions, though, are all theoretically answered by the economic way of thinking. So let's get into that. Economic way of thinking hits upon three major points, or I should say it's supported by three major pillars. Those pillars are, and these pillars are effectively assumptions as well. So you could also say these assumptions are that opportunity costs matter, that our decision to make one choice, it matters in the sense of what we're missing out on. And we should take that into consideration in our analysis, not just what we're getting, but also what we're missing out on, and an evaluation of whether the choice that we're making is worth it in consideration of what we're missing out on. So an easy way to think of opportunity costs is to think of transit, right? If you are a student attending BMCC, you have basically two major options for getting to the campus. You can take the 2 train or one of the red line trains in New York City, or you could take the A train or C train, effectively. Your decision to take one train, for example, the A train, it shouldn't just be considered in the context of your choice to take the A train. You should also think about what did you miss out on by not taking the 2 train to get down to BMCC. You took the A train today, and as a result, you missed out on that once-in-a-lifetime interaction on that platform with that one individual who was going to become your lifelong partner. And as a result, for getting to class on time, your opportunity cost is being loveless for the rest of your life. you would probably want to know that that is the opportunity cost you're paying for picking the A trade, because that is a cost that you may not be willing to bear, and it may influence your decision on which train to take. The next assumption we make is that people are rationally objective oriented and operate in their own self-interest of achieving those objectives. This is a pretty big assumption, probably bigger than it seems on the surface. There are many reasons to assume that people are actually not that rational at all, and behavioral economics and the findings from behavioral research have strongly supported that as much as we think people are rational, and people may think that they are themselves rational, a lot of decisions that they make are on the surface. Well, a lot of decisions that people make are simply not in their own self-interest. And you would think that if somebody was rational, for example, right, they would make a better choice, but the choice is also a function of what information a person has. So you may think, well, somebody who's rational wouldn't decide to go gorge down on McDonald's after class because McDonald's has all these issues in its food products. There's heavy amounts of saturated fat, there's heavy amounts of sodium. All these things have been linked to chronic diseases that plague Americans regularly. Why would somebody consume this after class? Why would somebody consume this at all? That question assumes that somebody has the information to make the rational decision, which they may, and they may still make this irrational decision from our perspective, but they may also not have that information. And perhaps if they did have that information, their behavior would be closer to rational than it already is. So even built into this assumption is the assumption that someone who we're analyzing has as much information about their decision as we do. And while us as an observer may realize that cheeseburgers are the worst thing for somebody's health, the person consuming the cheeseburger may not realize that at all, and may be making a decision based on the rationality or the rational thought that they enjoy the flavor of a cheeseburger, or they enjoy the emotional satisfaction they get from eating a cheeseburger, and that is why they're choosing to eat that cheeseburger. So in our economic way of thinking, we already have to make assumptions to model behavior that don't really make sense, in the sense that we would assume that somebody would avoid hurting themselves, but clearly with the right incentive, somebody will make the decision to hurt themselves. And what part of the model is that, right? The final assumption is that people are aware of the impacts of small changes, so they achieve objectives by doing more or less of a behavior. This one is important because this is how we get to the idea of marginal choices. If people are aware of the impacts of the small changes that they make, then every choice is theoretically made on a margin, where someone decides, I've done n number of this activity already. Do I want to do n plus 1? Let me break that down in a less quantitative sense. I've already had 20 bites of this cheeseburger. Do I want to have the 21st bite? That would be a small change type of thing. Someone would be aware that the 21st bite has a certain amount of benefit that comes with it and a certain amount of cost. And theoretically, in our economic way of thinking, we would assume that that person would compare the benefit they got from having a 21st bite to the benefit that they got from having the 20th bite. They would also compare the cost between the 21st and the 20th bite, and they would make this informed decision of whether or not they wanted to have a 21st bite of that cheeseburger. Clearly, people don't think in these small moments of breaking down a decision to try to do a little bit more of this or a little bit less, but we assume that magnitude matters to people, even if it takes them a while to feel the magnitude. So while a person may not be measuring every bite of a cheeseburger they consume, we assume that in, well, a more macro way, a person will have a different reaction to having 2 cheeseburgers versus 1.5 cheeseburgers versus 1 cheeseburger. And that any one of those breakdowns or segments of cheeseburgers would result in having different impacts on the person as far as the benefits the person would accrue versus the costs that they would be responsible for or would incur. And even if they don't realize that breakdown can go as far as the bites, we assume that what's happening on the bite level matters for what's happening on the burger to burger level. So the amount of bites that you take, even if each bite does matter and you don't realize it, we assume that as these bites accumulate into larger actions, it will matter enough to you that our model is still valid in analyzing the smaller behavior that led to that bigger outcome. So let's start applying this a little bit, right? Because of that last bit that I was talking to you about with choices and small changes, that kind of implies in that every choice is on what we call the margin, what I was just discussing, which is that every choice provides a certain amount of benefit and a certain amount of cost. Here I go into a little bit of an example that uses going to school an extra year, right? Where the marginal cost of going to school for an extra year may be your annual earning potential. Whatever you would have earned in that year, assuming that you never went to school in that same year, is what you're sacrificing now by going to school. The marginal benefit would be, in this random example, very theoretical, maybe the marginal benefit is having your annual earning potential increase by 5% next year, right? So the benefit is that there is additional rewards. There are additional rewards. There is an additional earning potential in the future, but that future earning potential requires you to sacrifice more earnings upfront right now. So with that information, you'd have to make the decision, should I go to school an extra year, right? And of course, this should be valid on a larger scale. Like maybe you're not thinking on the year-to-year basis, right? The same way you're not thinking on the bite-to-bite basis with the burger, but this decision applies to the idea of, should I go to school and get my bachelor's degree? Should I go to school even longer and get my master's? Is the PhD worth it? Everybody's decision in regards to that question, or any of those questions, will be different based on what they think their current earning potential is versus what they think the addition to their earning potential will be in the future, at least based on this very simple theoretical model that we just put up here. And of course, this assumes that all other things are equal, ceteris paribus, and they almost never are. We have to assume all other things are equal in our models, because if we don't, we would have a never-ending model and never-ending questions, right? Your decision to eat another bite of the cheeseburger and how that cheeseburger will impact you, those decisions, like those events, are influenced by so much that we would not necessarily be able to model. Like, yes, there may be additional saturated fat with every bite of that cheeseburger. The next question is, how much lettuce do you eat with the cheeseburger? Why does that matter? Well, because we have research suggesting that eating leafy greens with alongside fats, or especially saturated fats, may have an impact on arterial function. So the cheeseburger may not actually have the same cost for somebody who is eating that cheeseburger alongside a bowl of salad. How many cheeseburgers have you had today? Yesterday? What is your body weight? Do you have a history of heart disease? All these things would factor into a model, and yes, they are important for us to model, but those are just the beginning questions, right? Theoretically, there's so much in the world that is impacted by someone's decision and the decisions that they don't make, that we can't ever really have a model that takes into consideration everything. There are too many things for that to be the case. So at some point, we have to understand what variables we are including in the model, and then effectively close it up around those variables. And by closing it up around those variables, we assume that everything else in the world stays the same. So if everything else in the world stayed the same, if we, yes, considered if somebody was eating a salad, but we did not go to the extent of considering whether or not they had a history of heart disease in their family, we are assuming in this model, this is what happens to people who eat cheeseburgers versus those who eat cheeseburgers with a salad, assuming everything else about the two samples being studied is the same. And of course, they almost never are, even when you try to control for variables that you expect may have an impact on your outcome, you still may not be controlling for everything. And because human beings are human beings, they may mislead you, they may lie to you, so it becomes challenging at points to actually abide by the assumption that all other things are equal. And what we'll get into a bit later is that there's basically an attempt to balance these marginal costs and benefits. There's a lot of examination of this balancing of marginal costs and benefits in microeconomics. Macroeconomics doesn't focus on it as much, but the concept is that you will only, or I should say, a rational human being will only participate in a behavior up to the point where the marginal benefit from that behavior continues to exceed the marginal cost. As soon as the marginal cost exceeds the benefit, the person who is rational in our assumptions would stop the behavior. So you would assume that a person would only eat as many cheeseburgers as they would like, to the point that the cost of the cheeseburger, the health costs, the financial costs, do not exceed the benefits, the emotional benefits, the sensory benefits of consuming that burger. So what about other choices that we can make on the margin? Well, it's cool talking about burgers and salads, but in the world today, there's been a lot of discussion about just the idea of what type of services government should provide and whether or not it's providing enough of these services. So one choice on the margin, for example, is, do we need more NYPD officers? In a sense, you could literally analyze how much of an impact an additional officer has on certain outcome variables that you're looking at. So let's say your outcome variable is violent crime per 100 residents. We can analyze to see if the head count, the number of police officers in New York City, has a significant impact on the violent crime per 100 residents, basically the violent crime rate. If we find that it does, which isn't necessarily going to be the case, we may assume that there is a reason to think that police officers would have an impact on violent crime rates, but we should never fall into the presumption that two things are related to each other. We'll talk more about that in a sec. But right now, let's assume that they do. Let's assume that there is a statistically significant relationship between the amount of police officers in New York City and the violent crime rate in the city. We would then have a choice to make on the margin. At what point is it no longer worth it to hire an additional police officer? Basically, at what point does an additional police officer not produce the amount of benefit necessary to justify the cost of hiring that police officer? We would have to really think about what those costs and benefits are, right? One of the very obvious costs is the salary for that police officer, the future benefits that police officer would be entitled to in the form of pensions, the current benefits that a police officer is entitled to in the form of health benefits, right? A lot of these would be the very salient costs of hiring a police officer, but we also have to consider other things that may not be as obvious, such as how much an additional police officer brings us closer to a state of governance that we do not want. If we value living in a fairly liberal democratic republic where people have inalienable rights, then we have to consider whether or not an extra police officer takes us further away from that and closer to something that is more akin to a police state. But we also have to consider the benefits, right? And the benefits will also be as varied. Like the benefit that we may be looking at directly, maybe their impact on violent crime rates. You may also want to consider the benefit of just having a presence, a government presence in a neighborhood. Will people feel like there is more of a consideration for what's going on in their neighborhood? Will people feel like there is less crime just because there is an officer around, even if crime has not declined at all? All of these are things that you would want to consider in this question of making a choice on the margin, which is effectively what the defund NYPD and other kind of movements that question our financing of police officers is getting to. It's getting to the idea that on the margin, in the opinion of some people, there is not a need for additional police officers. That an additional police officer brings more cost than benefit, and that we should reconsider the hiring of more police officers. Some would obviously go to the direction of suggesting that we should consider letting go and reducing our headcount of police officers, because we may have already exceeded that point where the marginal cost of a police officer has exceeded the benefit of that police officer. So to get to all of this, right, we have to be cognizant of the scientific method. And it's important that we break down the scientific method so that you understand that what we're studying, the study of choice, is a science. We're not just going off of what we feel like and what we think is happening. There is, to some extent, theory, and theory may be based on just observations of what's happening around you and trying to analyze those observations. But there is also a statistical analysis of empirical or real life data that is important to not only understanding whether or not the theory is valid, but understanding what the context is around when that theory is valid. So let's get to the basic scientific method. The scientific method starts off with background research, which is usually scouring things like academic journals, observing what's going on out in society. The point of background research is to not recreate the wheel. You want to see what is happening so that you have an understanding that will inform the question that you want to ask about the world around you. So let's say that you're walking around outside, you're doing your thing, and you start to observe that people are buying Supreme gear on the internet, even when the price of the gear itself in the second market is far higher than the price when it's first released by Supreme. This is part of your background research, right? So now you're going to try to collect this information. Like, you think this is what's happening, but now you have to cement this information. So you have to go out there and see, like, all right, has anybody else observed this? Has anybody else noticed that the Supreme gear is selling at wildly higher prices in the secondary market than in the primary market? Has anybody else written anything about this? Has anybody else done any other research on this? Maybe the questions that you have already been answered and you just need to study to find them. Let's say you go through all this and you still have questions. You have actually a hypothesis, which is the second step here and is a testable question. So let's say that after observing all of this stuff about Supreme and how it sells in the secondary market, you formulate a hypothesis that is that Supreme gear would not sell as well in the secondary market if the price was lower than in the primary market. Now, this would be an interesting hypothesis because what you'll learn about in Chapter 3 is that there's something that we call the law of demand, which suggests that as price goes down, you should see more buyers enter a market to purchase a good or service. So just the hypothesis that a lower price would mean that fewer people would buy it has a whole lot of implications, and it's probably a pretty cool place to start your study from, right? So now you're going to do your primary research, which means that you're going to either do an experiment, or you're going to survey, or you're going to identify a population, a sample that you want to observe and observe their behavior. Let's say that you decide that you want to run an experiment, and you're going to take a randomized group of individuals. You're going to separate some of them and use them as what we call a control group, and you're going to separate the others and use them as an experimental group. You've done your analysis by asking all the people in your samples questions to figure out whether or not you have two balanced groups between your control group and your test group. So you want to make sure that your control group is very similar to your test group, so that you can definitely identify the things going on in your test group are very much so related to what you're asking about, rather than to the difference between Tom and Jerry, right? You don't want the difference between two individuals to be the explanation for your outcome. You want the experiment that you're actually running to be the explanation. So you go through this whole process. You've made sure that your control group is statistically similar as far as their demographics, as far as their experiences, as far as other traits that you could imagine. They're similar to the group that you're testing on, and you decide to run an experiment where your control group sees a Supreme branded hat in a primary market, and then they see the price of it in a secondary market, and you ask them whether or not they would buy it. You've already controlled for income, so it doesn't matter. You just ask them, would you buy it at this price? And then you take your test group, you show them the exact same Supreme hat, but then you show them the hat in the secondary market at a lower price, and you ask them the same question, would they buy it at this price? Now, if you've done this correctly, you would hopefully have results that you can report on, which is step 4. And these results should be statistically significant. At the very least, they should be interesting. So I'm not going to get into the depths of statistical significance versus interest. I will just say that although we pride ourselves on finding statistically significant results, if you find results that are not statistically significant, it doesn't mean that they should be thrown out. It might mean that they are a hint about further research that you should do. But let's just say in this, you found results that are statistically significant because you've analyzed the findings, and you found that yes, there is actually a difference in how people react to Supreme gear in the secondary market based on whether or not the price is lower or higher than what it was in the primary market. You would write this up, you would report it, and then you would finally, in your publication, discuss what you found and what you reported in context. So while you reported the data, you reported the actual numbers. We had X people in group A, we had X people in group B. Group B was the control group. Group A and Group B had averages for incomes, average age, geographies that were comparable, and the results for Group A were different than the results from Group B. Group B, being the control group, had results that we would expect to be the case based on what we've seen in the rest of the world, but Group A had statistically significant results that were different from what happened in Group B. And now, after reporting that data, you want to get into a discussion. And you would use a discussion to talk about what your findings suggest in the context of what has already been researched and published in the past, based on what you found in background research, and also discuss your results as far as what questions they lend themselves to, right? So your study was probably very, very targeted, as it should be. It was a question that was testable. You tested that question. Now you know that people do behave differently with Supreme gear when it's priced lower than it is in the primary market. But that doesn't tell you why or other contexts for how people may behave. It doesn't give you too much information, but it does leave the door open for someone else to run a study that then builds upon that question. So then maybe the next question that you want to ask, or the next question that somebody else may want to ask, may be something along the lines of, Supreme is a luxury good, and therefore, as a luxury good, we would expect people to react negatively to a lower price on it than they would to a higher price. That may not be the perfectly testable question, but it is a building upon the question that you asked. And that is what's most important with the research, that you do targeted research that answers a testable question and allows other researchers to build upon the answer. The final stage is usually peer review, where your published paper gets ripped apart by other doctors and experts in the field who say things that may make you feel bad and maybe possibly even cry in the moment, but are meant to refine the science. Like, the peer review is actually a very critical part of the science. Studies can be published, but it's very important that the study published is reviewed by other researchers, because as researchers, we have our own biases. And even when we try to eliminate our bias, it's very possible that our biases can seep into the research that we're doing and cloud our judgment. So why do we use the scientific method? We use the scientific method for three major reasons. I'm going to go over them here now. We use it so that we can accurately and consistently model the effects of different independent variables upon dependent variables. And what I'm showing you here is the supply and demand model. We will get into the depths of this in chapter 3, but for now, all I really want you to appreciate is that in the supply and demand model, which is a model of a market, we assume that the price on the y-axis, which is the axis going up and down, that the price is the independent variable, and we want to model the impact of different prices upon the dependent variable, which is on the x-axis, which we call quantity. So in the supply and demand model, right, we are trying to understand the effect of different prices upon quantities demanded. It's important that we understand the differences between independent variables and dependent variables. An independent variable is comparable to the handles on your faucet, right? By changing the handle position on the faucet, you can change the outcome of the water coming out of the faucet, right? In the sense of the temperature. So by changing the handlebar position, you can change the temperature. And similarly for independent versus dependent variables, by changing the independent variable, we can change the outcome upon the dependent variable. So the same way that you change the handlebar position on the faucet to change the temperature of the water coming out is the same way that you change the independent variable to see the outcome in the dependent variable. The dependent variable depends upon changes on the independent variable. Or I should say the value of the dependent variable depends upon changes to the independent variable. Similarly, in the supply and demand model, we are looking to see how the changes in the independent variable price have an impact on the dependent variable quantity. And specifically in the supply and demand model, we're trying to see how the changes in price have an impact on the quantity demanded and the quantity supplied. And the next reason that we use the scientific method, so that we can imagine a testable hypothesis, which may become a reliable theory or inevitably timeless law. So we use the scientific method to test out things, test out questions that can be tested, and see what comes about from that. And sometimes what you may get out of that is a good theory that is pretty consistent and regularly occurs in the real world and can be modeled. If it happens so consistently and so regularly, we may even consider it a law. So the law of demand suggests that as price decreases, the quantity demanded of a good or service should increase. We've seen that play out so many times that it's effectively considered law. There are very few situations. It's a rare situation where a good or service doesn't abide by the law of demand, and where the price of that good or service going down actually reduces the quantity of it demanded. But, for example, in the graph that you're seeing here, we have a life cycle theory, right? So the life cycle theory suggests that people go through various stages of accumulating income or debt based on where they are in life. So you may spend the first 20 years of your life in a debt situation because you're accumulating student loans, you're borrowing to invest in your future so that in your post 20 years, between 20 and 65, you are able to save because your investment in the first 20 years of your life allows you to earn enough income that for the next 25 years, you're able to save up money. You're able to save more than you're consuming. You spend the first 20 years consuming more than you actually have in income, and then you spend the next 25 years saving money because you're consuming less than you have in income. And then finally, there's a stage 65 and over where you are assumed to be retired, where you would enter dis saving, where you start to pull down from the savings that you accumulated over those last 25 years to allow yourself to retire and no longer have to work. The income life cycle is a theory because, yes, this applies almost neatly in most Western nations, but it doesn't apply everywhere and equally to everybody, right? This may be the life cycle for someone who's a American-born citizen. It may not be the life cycle for an immigrant. It may not be the life cycle for someone living in Southeast Asia. It may not be the life cycle for someone living in Central America. But this theory applies well within Western nations that are developed. And that's why it is just a theory as opposed to the law of demand, which is based on something that's seen pretty much globally. And then the final reason why we use the scientific method, it's so that we don't fall for the fallacy of false cause. We want to avoid the fallacy of false cause because correlation of two variables does not mean that one variable caused the other. So I kind of hinted at a little bit of this when I was talking to you about the police officers, right? And the choice on the margin. So in our little NYPD thought experiment, we assumed that a police officer had a statistically significant impact on violent crime rates. That may not necessarily be so, and we may just be presuming that because two things are happening at the same time, because we have increased our head count of police officers over time at the same time that the city has had declining violent crime rates, we may be assuming that the correlation between the two, the correlation between an increasing NYPD head count and a decreasing crime rate means that the increasing NYPD headcount caused the crime rate to decrease. The issue there is that we might be falling into the fallacy of false cause. We may be failing to acknowledge that there's a third variable involved that perhaps we're not observing, that we're not paying attention to, that is actually the determinant of violent crime rates, or a better determinant of violent crime rates. The classic example of the fallacy of false cause is in the graph to the left. So you're basically looking at the instance of two different variables over time, right? You can tell this is over time because the x-axis is looking at the months January, February, March on until December. And the y-axis, to translate that from statistical speak, is basically looking at the frequency of this action in each month. I want to say this action because we're looking at two different variables, right? You're looking at one in the yellow line, the violent crime index. So you're basically looking at the cumulative frequency of violent crime in different months. You're also looking at the cumulative frequency of ice cream sales in different months on the red line. This is a classic example because the shape of both of these curves, the trends going on, may lead someone to naively assume that violent crime and ice cream sales are connected to each other. And they may even go as far as to assume that there is a causative relationship, that ice cream sales cause violent crime to occur, or that violent crime is a great way to pick up ice cream sales. The one thing that's missing is the third variable that isn't being observed. And thoughtful watchers are probably now thinking it's temperatures, right? What we do know is that higher temperatures tend to cause people to come outside, interact with each other more often. It may cause people to feel more frustrated, and it may lead, between all these factors, frustration, being outside, interacting with each other, it may lead people to have more confrontations with each other. And the more confrontations people have, it would be reasonable to assume the more likely violence will occur. Heat also causes people to seek comfort, and ice cream, as terrible as it may be as far as the saturated fat content, the issues with the link between cow's milk and cancer, it does provide a cold respite for people who may be finding the summer months to be very, very very distressing. So it would be no surprise that you would see the two of them basically increasing and decreasing at the same time, because they're both impacted by a third variable, temperature. This is where we get the phrase correlation does not equal causation. Just because two variables are moving in the same direction or are changing at the same time does not mean that one is causing the other to change. It may mean that there's a third variable that you're not looking at that is causing both of them to change. So now let's get a bit into the various areas of economics that you may be studying this semester. We have microeconomics, which usually focuses more on the interactions between individuals. We usually call them agents, or even companies within an economy. The thing with microeconomics is that it's almost always exclusively about things happening within an economy, as opposed to between economies. So questions in microeconomics might be, what is the efficient amount of employees to hire based on the level of capital that your firm has, right? I like to think of questions with microeconomics as akin to thinking about questions that maybe a bodega may face. They're very similar questions. How many people should I hire? What level of inventory should I keep? If I change my prices for my plantains to this level, what level will the other bodega a few blocks away from me, what will they do? Will they change their prices to match mine? Will they try to undercut me? These are the kind of things that you think about with microeconomics. This as opposed to macroeconomics. So what you're looking at here is the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, a few blocks away from CUNY BMCC. Macroeconomics thinks about things that would be dealt with by the Federal Reserve. Questions about inflation, questions about unemployment, questions that deal with how to not only manage your internal economy, but also how the things that you do within your economy impact how you interact with other economies. Macroeconomics is really asking these bigger questions about how economies interact with each other and how they interact with their own internal factors of production, their own internal issues, in a way that impacts the way they interact with each other. We also get into other areas of economics, right? So there may be questions that, okay, so we've just gone over microeconomics. We've just gone over macroeconomics. Within both of these, we can have what we call normative versus positive statements or even questions, right? Here's an example. Right now, what you're looking at are housing units in the Bronx. This is in particular an Art Deco building that I think is near the Grand Concourse. A normative question in relation to this might be, or a normative statement, I should say, in relation to this might be that New York City needs to do more to house to provide affordable housing for its population. It's a normative question because it's suggesting what a norm should be. It's suggesting that there is a should, that New York City should do this thing, that we should have affordable housing, maybe even that there needs to be more affordable housing. The idea here is that there isn't a statement being made about the state of something as much as there is a statement being made about what ideals should be achieved. A positive statement might be that New York City's housing vacancy rate is well below 3%. It's a positive statement because it is actually saying a fact. It's not positive because it is a good statement versus a bad statement. It's a positive statement because it's just stating a fact. It's stating a fact that may accompany the normative statement from before, but notice how different it is, right? While the normative statement said that we should provide more affordable housing, while it made a statement about how things should be, the ideal, the other statement, the positive statement, is simply stating the fact of the situation. Nothing can be changed about that fact. We can argue back and forth about whether or not there is an appropriate amount of affordable housing being provided. And while one side may be right or wrong, the point is that we can have a threshold that differs between each other, that influences the value statement that we're making, right? To someone else, there may be enough affordable housing in New York City, and the problem with housing might be something else. To one person, the problem might be that there is not enough affordable housing in their opinion. The fact that our housing vacancy is below 3%, which means that fewer than 3% of units in the entire market are actually vacant, is a fact. It cannot be debated. It is not a truth that is up for debate. It's not like there's another truth that is different from that. The truth is that is what the vacancy rate is. That truth might inform your normative opinion. It might inform whether or not you think there's enough affordable housing, but that is just the truth. And that is the difference between a normative and positive statement. Normative statements are shoulds. They express ideals, hopes, goals. Positive statements are expressions about the state of something currently. They are effectively just factual statements. You can talk about the need for jobs in an economy, but the unemployment rate is the unemployment rate. There is no real debate around what the unemployment rate is. You might debate which unemployment rate to look at, but the positive statement is the unemployment rate is X. The normative statement would be we need 1,000 more jobs for people who are structurally unemployed. So why do we care about this normative versus positive? We care because we can't just have one or the other, right? It may sound like, oh, of course you would want to just stick to the facts, right? That sounds like the ideal in a science. You only want to discuss the facts of the situation, what is actually happening. But we also do need ideals because as much as economics is a science, it's a science that is social. And in it being a social science, we're discussing outcomes of real human beings. And therefore, it's not only important to understand where we actually are, but to also understand what we may want to do. What are the goals that we have? What do we want to achieve? And what do we value, right? So perhaps we know in this budget production possibilities curve, which you'll learn more about in the next chapter. Perhaps from this, we know that we can make 8 pounds of beans and no pounds of rice, or we can make 12 pounds of rice and no pounds of beans. And maybe there's somewhere in between that we can land, but we know that that is our budget constraint. We know that that is the possibility for our economy. That's a positive statement, right? It's a positive statement because I'm literally saying we can make 8 pounds of beans and no pounds of rice. We can do the other option. We can do some option in between those. But we may also want to understand what would be our ideal for how much rice and beans we would like to produce. What would be our ideal for where we would want to stretch out our production possibilities? That requires normative thinking. That requires thinking about, like, here is what the fact is. Here are another set of facts as well. And here are the thoughts that we should be informed about based on those facts. we know this is happening in this area. We know that is happening in that area. What do these happenings mean for what we would want to achieve as a society that values democratic rights, right? Or as a society that values social mobility, as a society that values merit being the primary determinant of someone's economic outcome. Those would be more normative statements. The positive statement may be social mobility is stagnant. It may be that income inequality is high because half the country's income is going to 10% of the population. But the normative statement would be we need to make social mobility we need to have social mobility that reflects our values as a nation. So it gets to the understanding of like if we want to get from making only 8 bags of beans or 8 pounds of beans and no pounds of rice to a situation where we could make 16 pounds of beans and no pounds of rice, or 24 pounds of beans and no pounds of rice. The only way to get there is to not only understand where we currently are, but to understand what we would want to achieve to get there. You can think of this also in different terms, right? Like we're talking about beans and rice here, but what if we were actually talking about education and law enforcement? We may know that we have X amount of police officers and X amount of professors. That's a positive statement. We have 30-something thousand police officers. We have, I don't even know, maybe let's say even 30,000 something professors as well. I don't even know if that's necessarily true. Definitely isn't true. Whatever the number of professors are in New York City, we have that number of professors. Now we want to make normative statements. Do we think we have enough of either? Do we want to have more or less? What values do we have as a city? And how do those values inform the decision we want to make around how many police officers or professors we hire? That will inform us about how we not only understand where we currently are, but how to expand our possibilities so that our economy can grow and prosper. All right, that is the end of chapter 1. If you have any questions at all, feel free to reach out to me. If you're in the class, you have the syllabus and you have the contact information on there as well. If you're following digitally, you can reach out to me on Twitter at the handle Econ Mullings. That's EconMullings. Or if you have any other questions that you don't want to tweet out to me, you can also leave comments below. Alrighty, have a good one.